Today I wanted to do more of a Houdini walkthrough rather than a step-by-step tutorial where I focus on some of my thoughts in creating an effect like this and some of the fundamental workflows when dealing with the Pyro solver within Houdini. So if that's interesting to you, stay tuned. Okay, so here we are in Houdini. So this whole idea for this little test was for further exploring the OpenCL Pyro simulation tools that are now in Houdini, and also Karma XPU rendering with my new GPU. And I had seen a video by John Coons where he had created these tubes emitting foam, and I thought this could be a fun test, but instead of foam we could have it emitting smoke and do a pyro sim. So the first step for this setup was to create just this tube-like geometry, kind of wacky inflatable tube man feel behind it, to be the emitter for the pyro simulation. So my first thought when creating this was I could just do a simple hair sim on a line here in Houdini. So I made a line, I pinned the root point of the line by creating a group, created a vellum hair constraint, and then ran it through just a very simple vellum solver. I don't think I really changed much, and I got this type of animation, which is similar to what I wanted, kind of this spewing tube, smoke tube, but I was thinking it would be nice to have like a rippling surface like that inflatable tube man. So this being Houdini, I thought, oh, I'll just add another sim on top of this to create some rippling cloth. And so this was the first kind of test, and I quickly realized this is kind of dumb what I'm doing. But I went ahead and tried to make geometry from the spline and then run it through another Vellum sim. And this is the type of result I was getting, which is fine, but it would need tweaking and everything. And I was thinking, what am I doing? I should just sim it like cloth from the beginning. And so that's kind of the beauty of Houdini. You can do these quick experiments and then kind of pivot your approaches very easily. And so I started a new setup here, similarly starting with a line, but I create the line geometry right off the bat with this sweep node. And then I do the same idea with the line, and I pin the bottom points with the simple expression. Anything close to the ground here is getting pinned. And then I go ahead and set up just a simple cloth, make sure to set my pin points here, and then run that through a Vellum solve. And then I get this type of result, which is much more what I wanted to see, and actually a lot faster than trying to do this whole like hair sim and then a cloth sim on top of it. So much more simple idea. And I'm not going to deep dive into Vellum, but Houdini has tons of great resources on Vellum, and especially Paul Estevez's series on the Houdini YouTube channel is really great, and I can link that in the description as well. So now I had my emitter set up. I wanted to start emitting smoke from it. And so the first thought I had, I went through a few different iterations about how to actually accomplish this. The first thing I tried was actually adding an emitter down at the base here and trying to blow smoke all the way through this tube and out the top. I don't think I have a... I'll get to that experiment. a test of that, but it wasn't working. It required the way the collisions were ending up, it needed too many substeps, and then it was kind of tricky to deal with getting the smoke to actually blow up this whole tube. So I decided to simplify my life and just make an emitter right at the top of the tube. And so in order to do that, I haven't cleaned up this graph at all, so you can see it's a little messy, and this is just experimentation. But to isolate the top of this tube, what I ended up doing is creating a group here of the unshared edges, so that'll group the top and the bottom. I promote that group to points, and then I blast those, and then I delete the ones at the bottom with a similar expression as with the pinning, just deleting any of the points that are on the ground. And then I create a polygon from those points, and that automatically is following the tube animation and deforming with it. And if I template my tube here, you can see I have this polyfill right at the top. And so I can emit smoke from there, and it matches the animation, and I don't really have to deal with the collisions and those details that would require an emitter at the bottom. And so I wanted to kind of break down the general principle of creating these pyro sims, and I found that working with these in the last few tests I've been doing is really straightforward and pretty nice. So let me set up just a simple example of this off to the side here to illustrate the general workflow for creating any type of smoky pyro simulation. So really there's 3 steps to the process. You want to have points, which can be generated any way, but also can be generated with this pyro source node. And then you want to add attributes to those points, and then turn them into a volume that is brought into the pyro simulation. And so those steps are pretty much true for any type of pyro sim you're going to make. So to make one from scratch really fast for demo purposes, I'll just create a sphere here at the origin. And then I will use the relatively new pyro source node to create points within that sphere. And you can change the mode to volume scatter to create them inside. And I can lower the particle separation if I want more of them. And you can automatically create the attributes that are needed for a pyro sim here. And for people just getting into Houdini, this is really the crux of a lot of setups within Houdini. You're dealing with geometry, oftentimes points, and then attributes on those points. So if you go to the geometry spreadsheet right up here, I also have it in my own layout down here. You can see all the attributes for the points. And so once I lay down this pyro source node, I can create all the attributes that are needed for the pyro simulation. So the main one is called density. And when I type in density, you can see now all these points have a density of 1. Another attribute that's needed for pyro sim is oftentimes temperature. You don't always need that if you're just doing a smoke sim, but it will determine how the fire and smoke rise, and especially if you're doing fire, you would need it, not necessarily smoke. And then velocity, and I'll generate this here as well. And the Houdini name for velocity is V, and it's a vector. So just to start, I'll just have it pointing straight up in the Y direction. So I set it to 0, 1, 0. And so now that we have these points with attributes on them, we can just turn those points into a volume using the volume rasterize. So I'll go ahead and make a new volume rasterize attributes node and plug that into here. And I will go ahead and rasterize my density, my temperature, and my velocity. And so now we actually have a volume that is created from points. So that's pretty cool. Now we're ready to just throw this into a Pyro solver. And I'm going to change this to minimal OpenCL solving to use the GPU. And what I usually like to do is create a box off to the side and link the bounds of this solver to the size of the box. So you can right-click copy parameter, right-click paste relative reference, copy parameter, paste relative reference. And now you can use these boxes handles in the viewport just to set the bounding box more easily. So I'll go ahead and make a bigger bounding box for the smoke. And this is, if you're using CPU simulation, specifically the sparse simulation, you don't need to set your bounding box and Houdini will automatically resize it for you. But for the minimal OpenCL solve, you need to set your bounding box for that. Then the other thing to be aware of with the minimal CL solve, OpenCL solve, is the source range. So we actually just want to use our whole timeline, and I'll go ahead and check off cycle because we don't want it to cycle. We just want it to sim the timeline, and that's it. So without varying these attributes or anything else like that, just using the defaults for everything, let's just see what happens. You get some warnings, and then you get this flowing smoke. It doesn't really look that interesting. It's just going straight up. And I'm going to check off flame because we're not using flame. One reason why it's going up so fast is because of the temperature. We could go ahead and just tone down the temperature a bit. And it's not going up as much. But for the actual shape, you can go to the shape tab and maybe decrease the buoyancy as well so it's not rising up so fast. And if we want to start adding some variance and detail to this, we can start varying these source attributes. So one easy way to get some more interesting motion is to vary up the velocity so it's not just this totally straight upward flowing smoke. Houdini has a node for that called attribute adjust vector. So it's automatically defaulted to V for velocity. And I can go ahead and change the operation. I'll keep that at add, but I'll change it to adjust with noise. And I'll do zero centered. So it's pushing the velocities both negatively and positively. And to visualize this, I can go back to my points, click on the I, and then alt-click on V, and I'll get this velocity arrows pointing in different directions. So I might want to decrease the element size a little bit just to vary it up, and I could even increase the amplitude. Let me just play around with these. So now we have this varied velocity. We have some shooting off that way and going upward. And you can change this animation to on. So we actually have a moving velocity field. And so let's go ahead and go back to our Pyro solver here and see how this looks. So now you can see we're already getting a much more natural looking smoke. And this is without doing anything on this Pyro solver node yet. We have really just varied the velocity, and everything else is by default. We're not actually injecting or using any other fields or forces to transform this smoke. And so one other thing that you might want to vary as well is the density. And so there's a nice node for that called attribute adjust float. So that's kind of the companion node to the attribute adjust vector. And since density is a float, we'll do that and change the attribute name here to density, since this is defaulted to p-scale. And I'll go ahead and right click on the visualizer and uncheck V for velocity. And I will go ahead and alt click density to display that in the viewport. So right now we just have everything as a solid density. What I can do is very similar to the attribute adjust vector and change this to noise. So now we can adjust the noise patterning just like we did with the velocity. And so for this, maybe we want to actually multiply it from a 0 to 1 range. And so now we can see this visualizer. We have this varied density here, and I can do the same thing as the velocity and turn on animated noise. And so now we have this changing density. And I'll go ahead and just leave the element size just how it is, and maybe I'll just offset it so it has a slightly different seed, you could say, compared to the velocity noise. And so now let's go ahead and see how that looks. And you'll notice each time you change the source when you're using the GPU simulation, it has to reload in your source fields. So it's reloading in density, temperature for these 300 frames that we sent. That's why there's that little hiccup right at the beginning of the simulation when you change anything upstream. All right, so let's go ahead and press play. And so now we're getting a little bit more variation to the density. And so really with just those attributes, you can create tons of different smoke effects and different things. The other options you'd probably want to look at is all these under the shape tab. You have the main two disturbance and turbulence. And so this is for adding in some smaller scale noise with disturbance and larger scale noise with turbulence. So let's just go ahead and check both of those on and not even change anything and see what we get. We're getting a little more noise from the disturbance in the smoke. And then if I just really crank disturbance up, you can see it starts to break apart the smoke more. And if you look under these menus, you can change how big the turbulence is. So now we're getting just a more general a swirling of the smoke. And if I really start bumping this up, you can see it starts deteriorating. And then as I crank, we were actually getting a more, I said more general, but now we're getting the more general swirling. And then if I crank this down, we get a tiny noise pattern going through the smoke to create all of these little artifacts there. So you can see how responsive this solver is. You can change these values on the fly and literally get real-time feedback of your simulation. So I found that it's really nice to work with, and you can kind of develop your simulation like this, and then when you're ready to do your final cache, you could lower down your voxel size. And that's really the backbone of how you can create any pyrosim. You're taking points, you can generate them by this pyro source, you can have them just off any geometry and not use the pyro source, and then you're creating all the attributes that are needed to run this pyrosim, which are, in the case of smoke, density, temperature, and velocity in this case. For other simulations, you might be dealing with burn and some of the other fields, but for this, it's very simple. And you would add any other fields just the same way as this. So then you can start doing things like, let's say you want to add a collider. You can create a box. There's this new collision source node. You can plug that into there, and the second output creates a VDB, and I'll go ahead and position this right above. And if I look at this null, we have this VDB of the box. Under here, I can check fill interior just so it's a solid volume. And this node will automatically name your volume correctly. And I can plug this into the second input of my solver, go to the collision tab, and it's already set up to read in individual volumes and collision. We can go ahead and keep it as static since I won't be animating this cube. And so let's go back to the solver. And I'll go ahead and turn off or turn down this turbulence that I added and go ahead and play. And so now you can see we're having the smoke actually go around this cube. And if I go ahead and scale this cube upward, the result will be more apparent. Reset my sim. So now we're getting this nice interaction with the cube. Okay, so let's say we want to do something else, like have something fly through the smoke, or a velocity affect the smoke as well, another different velocity. So let me move this collision source a little higher, and I will create a sphere. I'll move it up. Actually, I'll make a transform node. I'll move this up a bit and over. I'll keyframe the sphere here, move to frame 24. I'll actually keyframe the first frame at 24, then at 48, I will have it fly through the smoke sim key there. So now we have this sphere going through the area the smoke is emitting. And let's say we want this to affect the smoke field. What you can do, you could also add it as a collider, but one great workflow is creating another velocity field and injecting that into your solver. So now what we can do is create a velocity from the points on the sphere. So I'll go ahead and lay down a trail SOP. And one of the options for that at the top here is compute velocity. So now you can see we have velocity data in our spreadsheet on each of these points. And if I go ahead and visualize it by clicking on V again, you can see these long velocity lines of the direction this sphere is moving in. So we can go ahead and use the volume rasterize attributes again. And we will be rasterizing just V in this case. And now we have if I click on the eye, a single velocity volume, or VDB. And so what we might want to do is just change the name of this velocity so we can adjust it independently from this first velocity we made. So I can go ahead and put down a name node and set the group to V and change the name to V2. And if I middle mouse click on this or click the eye, you can see now this velocity is named V2. So all we have to do now is merge that into our stream before the solver. And on the solver itself, I'll go ahead and go to my sourcing tab, and I'm going to just delete flame since we're not using that. I'm just exiting so it stops solving. You can go ahead and click this brain to stop the automatic updates. And I'll go ahead and add one more source, and I'll say the source volume is now V2, and I'll also have that affect vel. So now we have our original V and our original V2 getting fed into this simulation as velocity. So let's go ahead and see what happens here. I'll uncheck the brain so we can actually get this solving. It's reading in the new data. And so I'll go ahead and press play. Didn't see anything happen. Let me template this. And to see if this is working, let's just very much up the source scale of our velocity. Oh, and so now I've realized I forgot to set this to vector. So velocity is a vector, so that's probably why I wasn't seeing anything. So let's see what happens now. And we see everything just go haywire because I cranked it so high for testing. Let me put it to 10. Still very extreme. Let's just try 0.5. There we go. And so now we're getting this object to affect our simulation. And so you can use that to generate anything you want. You could create velocity vectors that, instead of just flying through, you could create more of a circular velocity to get the smoke kind of swirling more. You could create a volume and then just create a curl noise to introduce more movement throughout the smoke. And so once you grasp this setup of creating points, creating attributes on them, and then rasterizing them, you can really do anything with this Pyro solver. That's kind of the bread and butter for creating any type of smoke effect you could imagine. And you can get more into it with jumping in here and using micro solvers and using other ways of affecting this simulation. But at the core, all you're doing is sourcing points, creating some attributes on them, rasterizing them or turning them into volumes, and then feeding that into the Pyro solver and letting it do its thing. And so let's go take a look at how I actually did that with the inflatable tube guy. Okay, so looking back over here at the tube setup. So where we had seen before that little sphere demonstration is the creation of the emitter. So this is essentially it plays the exact same role as the sphere in that little demo I just did. So I went ahead and created the Pyro source and created a density and temperature attribute on them. And then I used the attribute adjust vector, just like on the sphere, to create velocity data. You can see that here. So we're getting these varied velocities coming off of our tube top. And then I did the same thing with density, rasterized those attributes. And here I did something a little different. I decided I didn't really like the results that this velocity was giving me, so I went ahead and just deleted it with this blast node. And that's doing that by just inserting @name equals v. And I went ahead and created some custom velocities similarly to how we did with this sphere that went through the smoke, based off the tube itself. So for that, I went ahead and just scattered points on top of the tube using the Pyro source node to create one velocity. So the kind of whipping of the tube really affects or moves the smoke around. And I was liking how that was looking, but I wanted it to be applied in an even bigger area around the smoke. So what I did was create another Pyro source, and very similarly to the emitter, I just made a sphere at the top of the tube here, just by fusing those points together and copying a sphere to it. And I use this as another source to source in some more velocity and vary it up into the simulation. So this is kind of weird looking because I just kept adding and tweaking to get the sort of look I want, but at its core, it's just making different velocities and also merging them into the source field right here. So we have the density, the temperature, the velocity, and then 2 other velocities as well. And when you put that all into the Pyro solver, you get something like this. If I see the cache, I'll go ahead and do a quick flipbook of this. Okay, so that flipbook was taking a little long because this volume is so high voxel count, and I didn't optimize it at all for reading back. So this is a good time to mention that when you're dealing with caching of Pyro simulations, it's a good idea to convert your volumes to VDB. So you can see if I go to a later frame here that this has 216 million voxels, so it's probably even higher res than it needed to be, but I wanted to kind of push the limits of what the GPU could handle. And you see there's 3 different velocity fields, and that they're all volumes, not VDBs, located right here and here. And so one good optimization that's easy to do is to convert it to VDB, which drastically reduces the amount of voxels here, and then merge together the velocity volume, so it's just a single VDB. And then let's go ahead and flipbook this cache, which should load a little bit faster for the flipbook since it is a little bit less large. So I'll go ahead and flipbook that. Well, it's also pretty slow, so surprisingly, I think the fastest way just to show how that was looking is to just rerun the sim at a larger voxel size, and that kind of also shows you how fast this simming is. So I'll go ahead and press play. And so here's that's the collider we made flying in the background. That's not affecting this simulation. But here we see a live representation of this simulation, still at a pretty high voxel count, but playing incredibly quickly in the viewport. And so there's things that I could do to maybe make this a little bit better even. I might want to dial in the disturbance a little more, and the turbulence to get less of a uniform noisy pattern on some of this smoke. But overall, it was a good test, and I think you get some interesting results from the velocity data from the tube. You get some interesting swirling and pushing around of the smoke. And so that is how the smoke sim looked. And then the other thing I wanted to touch on in this little walkthrough is the look development of the shot. So what I like to do when working on just little experimentations like this is jump between the renderer and the viewport. So for this, I was in Solaris, and so I jump between the two and do test renders, and that kind of helps me decide where to take the look. And this being Houdini, one thing I tried was, oh, maybe it could be nice to also add some like streamers or something to the the outside of this inflatable tube man. So I'm like, oh, why not? Let's give that a shot. And so what I ended up creating was over here. I won't go in too much detail of this graph. I just wanted to kind of cover like the beauty of experimentation that this software offers. I essentially took my original tube, scattered some points on it, and then copied a line to those points. These points are getting deformed with the tube, so now I have a bunch of straight lines following that tube geometry. And then I take those lines, very similarly to the very first example, and run them through a hair sim. And what you get is something like this. Let me turn off the visualizer. You get this, hairy tube. And then I was like, oh, maybe I can actually generate more hair and use those as guides, which is what all this kind of spaghetti mess is doing, leading down to here. And so I used the hair gen to generate a lot more hair, and I went ahead and just flipbooked that. And then you get something like this. And so during the look dev portion, I was like, oh, let's play around with the materials on the tube, and maybe it could be like a weird, hairy, fleshy creature emitting smoke or something, just abstract and weird. And so if we jump to Solaris, I started dealing with that, and I got this result, which started to look a little phallic to me, especially with the spewing of the smoke and everything. It's not looking good, and decided to scrap that approach pretty fast. I think when dealing with phallic artwork, it could either end up a museum piece or maybe just become more internet smut. So since this is YouTube, I went a different direction and started playing around with this more just metallic foily texture, and ditched the hair idea completely. But it's fun to be able to jump back and forth, like I said, with these ideas. And in Solaris, you can take these snapshots and kind of see where you're going with it, and if you're on the right track. And I'm gonna do another tutorial just but about a simpler scene about bringing stuff into Solaris and my general workflow with this. It's nothing too complicated if you're familiar with it, but I do plan to make another video about actually bringing things into Solaris. The one thing to touch specifically for this one is that I did use the Karma XPU preview shader. So this is essentially the same shader as the Pyro Bake volume node, if I jump back to here, which is a great node in Houdini that maps your volumes onto Pyro shader material, and it's a very easy way of controlling kind of the density of your smoke, your scattering, your fire, secondary fire, etc. But this doesn't play well, at least that I know of right now, with Karma XPU. So I've been using this Karma XPU preview shader. If you click tab and do preview, you can see XPU Pyro preview. And so this functions a lot like that Pyro Bake shader, but with a little bit more limited functionality, but it works pretty well. And that's what I used for the shading of this. And I was gonna have it originally just be smoke, but then I thought it might be nice to add in the temperature to get some illumination just from kind of this singular point, and just have this kind of dramatic spotlight over top of it. And then you get something like this, and the renders are not too bad with the GPU. Let's spool this up. I think it was few minutes per frame. I forgot the exact render time, but just kind of look deving and previewing in the viewport is pretty responsive. You can see you get kind of a initial feedback, and if you let it sit for a second, you get pretty good idea of the results behind this. And you can see this fire is pretty much just faked with the temperature. I wasn't, really aiming for that at the start, but you can see the kind of results you get just by being able to tweak this sort of thing post-sim. You can get some interesting results on the shader level. All right, so that just about does it for this walkthrough. Not necessarily a tutorial, but more of just a general thought process and approach for dealing with some of these Pyro experiments that I've been having a lot of fun working on. And so hopefully some of this was helpful. Let me know if you all have any cool workflows for Pyro, and if you have any questions or want more coverage on anything I went over. Thank you for watching.